Over the last few years, we've all witnessed this Tory government plunging this Parliament and our broader politics into ever deeper chaos and disgrace. In that time, Scotland has been dragged out of the European Union against our will. It is, Madam Deputy Speaker, almost a year to the day when this Parliament was illegally prorogued. And in recent months, a raft of senior civil servants have been forced out the door. That instability is this UK Parliament's new normal. It is now part and parcel of a broken Westminster system, and here we are again, having dragged us deeper and deeper into their dangerous agenda for the last 4 years. Today, this right-wing Brexit cabal has reached rock bottom. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Internal Market Bill is the greatest threat to devolution that Scotland has faced since our Parliament was reconvened with the overwhelming support of the Scottish people in 1999. We are discussing the principles of a bill that this Tory government casually and brazenly admits violates international and domestic law. A bill that cynically uses the precious peace at the heart of the Good Friday Agreement is nothing more than a Brexit bargaining chip. Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill runs to 50 pages. But people across these islands have a right to know. They need to know exactly what it proposes to do. It does two fundamentally dangerous and undemocratic things. It breaks international law and it breaks devolution. These two facts explain why there's been such a widespread chorus of opposition to this bill. That opposition comes from every profession, every sector and every corner of these islands. It's why this legislation should and must be resisted by anyone who claims to respect the rule of law and by anyone who claims to respect the current devolution settlement. As we know, there is opposition on the Conservative benches. In the other place, the former Tory leader, Lord Howard, told the government that the legislation would result in the UK showing itself as having scant regard for its treaty obligations. You know, Madam Deputy Speaker, when your government is getting verbally slaughtered by a Brexiteer who, how shall I say, has something of the night about him, then it is as clear as day that the Tories have gone way beyond the pale. The Law Society of Scotland have commented on the bill, stating the following: This bill should, as a matter of principle, comply with public international law. Pacta sunt servanda should be honoured. Adherence to the rule of law underpins our democracy and our society. We believe that to knowingly break with the UK's reputation for following public international law could have far-reaching economic, legal and political consequences and should not be taken lightly. Madam Deputy Speaker, to knowingly break international law. I'm asking each member to think on this tonight. Every member has a choice. We know that this bill breaks international law. So many learned individuals, including the last Attorney General, have told us this. Tonight, this House can tell the government that it is not on, that this House is not going to be complicit in a breach of international law. And I would venture this is the responsibility that each member has. Every member, Madam Deputy Speaker, should examine their conscience. This is about a bill that breaches the terms of a treaty where the ink is barely dry, on the treaty that the governing party fought an election on delivering on. I will give way.
Giving way, and he's making points that go to the very heart of this bill. Does he, and I share his worries about them, but does he share my worries that there's also an attempt in the bill to curtail or prevent entirely judicial review once that law has been broken?
Well, I think the Right Honourable Lady is quite correct, because we know that the government has got into trouble with the judiciary over its actions in the past, and indeed I'll come on to talk about that. But the Right Honourable member who spoke for the opposition was quite correct when he said that the Prime Minister cannot pretend that he didn't know the terms of the treaty or its obligations when he signed it. That simply beggars belief. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a test for the House this evening. Do not wait for the committee stage. Legally, morally, ethically, the right thing to do is to vote down this bill tonight, and this House must be accountable. Do not follow the Prime Minister in acquiescing in breaking the law. Because if you vote for second reading tonight, that's exactly what you're all doing. That's exactly what you're all doing. So this is a test, and I understand the challenge that Conservative members face. Don't support the Prime Minister by breaking the law this evening. It is as simple as that. Of course, the Prime Minister has form. A year ago, he went to the Queen to prorogue Parliament, an illegal act that the courts forced him to reverse. Here he is again, although in this case he's not, because he's run off, woefully breaking international law this time, seeking to ask the Queen to enact legislation that breaks international law. We have the power individually and collectively to stop the Prime Minister in this act of madness this evening. This is a matter of principle. It is about this House saying not to breach our legal obligations, and I implore the House to do exactly that. Madam Deputy Speaker, we were expecting that the Secretary of State for Bays would have drawn the short straw in having to come here to argue for this dreadful piece of legislation, but he was stood down. But we all know who the parcel of rogues are who are actually behind this legislation. This bill has the fingerprints of the Prime Minister, the Cabinet Office Minister and, of course, Dominic Cummings. We've just heard the bluff and bluster of the Prime Minister in seeking to defend the indefensible. The Prime Minister can try all he likes to dress this up as a business bill, but no amount of dressing up will hide the fact that this is a naked power grab. The Tories are fooling no one, least of all businesses in Scotland. If this UK government were actually serious about delivering an ounce of business confidence, then they wouldn't be threatening to blow apart any hope of a future trade deal with the European Union.
I'm grateful to him. He clearly shares many of the concerns of the Labour front bench in the speech he's given so far. So can he confirm on that basis that he will be supporting the reasoned amendment in the name of the Leader of the Opposition?
I'm grateful for the question, and we will be voting against this bill this evening. We will not be supporting the reasoned amendment because of some of the other conditions which are attached to it, not least the fact that there should be a single market act that doesn't enshrine the rights of the devolved nations to be able to protect their own interests. That is the fundamental difference that we take this evening, and I ask the House to oppose the bill and vote down the bill at the second reading stage. The provisions of this legislation recklessly and deliberately risk a bad deal or increasingly the economic devastation of a no deal. You can't claim to support business whilst at the same time pursuing a bad Brexit. You can't claim to support business by burdening them yet with more economic uncertainty in the face of a global pandemic. A global pandemic where we know the challenges that we face. And yet, in the midst of this, the Prime Minister brings this bill. And you can't claim to support the Scottish economy by taking more economic powers away from Scotland's democratically elected Parliament. Madam Deputy Speaker, let me turn to some of the contents of the bill, and specifically the numerous aspects that will undermine the powers and authority of Scotland's Parliament. Clauses 2 to 9 contain sweeping powers which could act to compel Scotland to accept lower standards set elsewhere in the UK. That means standards in animal welfare, food safety and environmental protection, to name but a few. We all know the risk and the threat that will bring, especially for Scotland's farmers and consumers. This law is a Tory invitation for chlorinated chicken and hormone-injected beef in our supermarkets. Well, you know, we can hear the guffawing. We can hear the guffawing from the Conservative benches. But yesterday morning on Politics Scotland, a Treasury Minister more or less admitted that they could not stop chlorinated chicken coming into the United Kingdom. Go and check the tapes. It's there. Yeah, I'll give way.
I'm very grateful to him. I'm sure he shares my dismay that the non-discrimination clause in this would mean that popular policies already made by Welsh Government and our Senedd to do with the smoking ban, the ban on plastic bags and also organ donation, those could have been called in and not been valid under this legislation.
My honourable friend makes a very good point. And there are policies which we are very proud of that we introduced in Scotland, like minimum alcohol pricing, which was so critical in dealing with misuse of alcohol in Scotland. But there is no guarantee that we would have the ability to bring in such initiatives in the future. We would have to go cap in hand to Westminster for authority. You know, the days of us being too wee, too poor and too stupid, Madam Deputy Speaker, are well and truly over. In Part 4, provision is made for the establishment of the kind of sneering contempt that we get from the Cabinet Secretary. He really ought to be ashamed of himself. In Part 4, provision is made for the establishment of a new unelected monitoring body called the Office of the Internal Market. The bill proposes to hand this unelected body, you know, we often hear about unelected bureaucrats, but here we are, Madam Deputy Speaker, an unelected body that will have the power to pass judgment on devolved laws directly over the heads of the Scottish people's chosen government. It will also lead to an open invitation for businesses with deep pockets to challenge the democratic decisions of our Scottish Parliament. Madam Deputy Speaker, Clause 48 reserves state aid, one of the most blatant power grabs in this bill, and that is a very high bar. We know that the state aid provisions will merely mirror those of the World Trade Organisation. This will inevitably make a deal with the EU even more difficult and provide little or no scrutiny. And finally, Clause 46, the ultimate insult and the ultimate attack on devolution. If this legislation is forced through, powers will be given to UK government ministers to design and impose replacements for EU spending programmes in devolved areas. Infrastructure, economic development, culture and sport, education and training, all of it. Their agenda is clear. The Transport Minister would have input and decision-making powers over road building in Scotland, over the heads of the Scottish Parliament. You know, we won a referendum in 1997. 75% of the people of Scotland voted in that referendum to have a parliament. We have elections every 5 years. Manifestos are put in front of the Scottish people. It is a settled will of the people that that parliament has control over health, over education, over housing and transport. How dare this Tory government feel that it can come in and it can impose its will on these areas of democratic accountability in Scotland? What an insult to our Parliament in Edinburgh, to our Parliament in Wales. And I will say this to this government: we will stand up against this attack on our Parliament and those that enshrined that Scottish Parliament. The agenda of the Conservatives is clear. The Tories will seek to bypass democratically elected MPs and ministers in Scotland. Union Jack badge projects will be paid for and prioritised ahead of the priorities of our Parliament. Bitter experience is a good teacher. Tory governments can't be trusted to spend money in Scotland. We remember what happens when the Tories control state aid spending. In 1992, John Major's government diverted cash from the Highlands to try and boost dwindling Tory support in South East England. And we haven't forgot that this legislation comes from a Prime Minister who bragged that a pound spent in Croydon is far more value to the country than a pound spent in Strathclyde. That's the way that the Conservatives look upon Scotland. The Tories will look after their own interests. They will never, not ever, support Scotland's interests. This bill would allow them free rein to serve their own narrow needs. Madam Deputy Speaker, at its heart, this bill confirms the centralising obsession of this UK government. Those in Number 10 who, not so long ago, made a lucrative living by scribbling endless newspaper articles about a supposed centralised Brexit Brussels elite are now attempting to centralise and grab every devolved power that they can get their hands on. Apparently, the Tories are not only determined to preside over the death of devolution, they're clearly determined to oversee the death of irony too. The real reason behind their hunger to pursue this power grab is what should concern us most, though. Paragraph 26 of explanatory notes makes it clear that the Business Secretary will be given the power to change exemptions from the bill at any time. In effect, this is a Trojan horse, allowing Tory ministers to encroach even further on devolution. And we know where that will inevitably lead. In order to deliver bad trade deals, the only deals they can now realistically get, the Tories want private health companies to have a guaranteed right to trade unhindered in Scotland and across the UK. With no protections for our Parliament, this would fundamentally weaken and undermine our National Health Service in Scotland. The same is true for private water companies, with the same threat of undermining standards and raising prices in Scotland. Their real agenda is about imposing the creeping privatisation and rampant deregulation that they're already implementing in England. Madam Deputy Speaker, I am heartened by one thing. The scale of the threat of this legislation has been equalled by the scale of opposition that it has been met across Scottish society. The opposition benches, especially the Scottish Tories, would do well to listen to this. Well, mind you, there's only one of them in here. NFU Scotland confirmed that the proposals pose a significant threat to the development of common frameworks and to devolution. Chair of the Scottish Crofting Federation, Yvonne White, expressed fear that the proposed legislation will lead to a race to the bottom, threatening our high standards in food, environment and animal welfare, and thus damaging the image of Scottish produce. She concluded that these standards are best safeguarded by the Scottish Parliament. You know, shouting from a sedentary position, don't let the facts get in the way. That is a statement. That is a statement, Madam Deputy Speaker, from the chair of the Crofting Federation. Might not suit the Tory benches, but that's the reality. The Scottish Council for Development and Industry believe that mutually agreed common frameworks should be the foundation of the UK internal market, rather than the imposition of a single approach across the UK in devolved policy areas. And I have to say the SCDI are absolutely right. Why isn't the Joint Ministerial Committee finishing the work it was engaged on in delivering those frameworks on a consensual basis? But of course, that doesn't suit the Tory government that want to attack our democratic institutions. The General Teaching Council for Scotland said supporting the bill would undermine the 4 UK nations' devolved education functions. On its impact on, well, I hear the Cabinet Secretary shouting how. Well, perhaps he should go and talk to the General Teaching Council, and he will give them their views directly. Really, we've got the Minister who's supposed to be taking this bill through, sitting laughing at the legitimate comments made by stakeholders in Scotland. It's little wonder, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Tories are rejected the way they are at the polls in Scotland. On its impact on devolution, Professor Nicola McEwen, co-director of the Centre for Constitutional Change, found that the Internal Market Bill limits policy divergences and risks stifling innovation. And the STUC stated that the Prime Minister is uniting political parties, trade unions and the wider civil society in Scotland against a power grab which would see UK government interference in previously devolved matters and the rolling back of the devolution settlement that we voted for in 1997. Madam Deputy Speaker, what is happening is that the Tories are uniting civic Scotland against this attack on our Parliament and its powers. Farmers, crofters, teachers, industry, academics and trade unions, a coalition of opposition to this bill and this Tory agenda. Civic Scotland has made their voices and views crystal clear. Anyone supporting this bill will be ignoring their interests. Madam Deputy Speaker, we all have a responsibility to listen to these voices. The new Scottish Tory leadership have been running around half the summer telling anyone who would listen just how keen they were to stand up to the Prime Minister when he thinks he is wrong. Well, you have that chance tonight. Listen to the coalition of opposition in Scotland rather than your masters in Downing Street. If the Scottish Tories follow their colleagues into the lobbies in support of this power grab, they will expose themselves as being weaker than ever, of failing to stand up for Scotland's interest against a London power grab. The very first test of the new Scottish Tory leadership will have turned out to be its biggest, and they will have failed. They will simply have shown themselves to be the Prime Minister's poodles, turning their back on Scotland's interests. They will have failed once again to stand up for Scottish democracy. Madam Deputy Speaker, there is also a special responsibility that falls on the Labour Party. Much of the devolution project is a legacy of its government in 1997. This bill is a direct attack on that legacy. We must collectively oppose this bill. I am urging the Labour Party at every parliamentary stage to take full responsibility and work collectively with us to hold this government to account. The Welsh Labour government are advising the same. They have said the UK government plans to sacrifice the future of the Union by stealing powers from devolved administration. It is an attack on democracy and an affront to the people of Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, who have voted in favour for devolution on numerous occasions. Madam Deputy Speaker, that statement and its analysis comes to the very core of this argument. Over the course of the last 21 years of devolution, Scotland's people have benefited from the progressive and divergent priorities that our own governance has given us the freedom to pursue. They have seen it, they have experienced it, and they have come to fiercely value it. Even with limited powers, Scotland's Parliament and our government has always sought to mitigate or reject the Conservative policy paths set out at Westminster. We have forged our own path. If this legislation had been enforced previously, it would have presented many progressive policies and divergent choices. Over recent months, that conviction and belief in our Parliament has grown. People have seen the exceptional leadership of our First Minister throughout the course of this terrible pandemic. It's reaffirmed their faith and confidence in our institutions, in our governance and in our nation. Our people have come to a simple but powerful conclusion. Decisions about Scotland are best made in Scotland. And right now, poll after poll, the latest one only last Friday, shows that a growing majority have come to the conclusion that all decisions and all powers should now be fully entrusted to the people of Scotland. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Tories have never been able to reconcile themselves to that truth. As usual, when they're confronted with change, they are in the depths of denial. Instead of accepting the right of Scottish people to choose their own future, they are trying to grab the powers back that were returned to Scotland 21 years ago. That is exactly what this law is designed to do. It is a full frontal attack on Scotland's Parliament and an attack on Scotland's democracy. It has been stated that power devolved is power retained. It implies that this Tory government can do anything they like with the powers of our Parliament. That is what this bill is about. It gives them direct spending in Scotland in devolved areas, in health, in education, in housing, in transport. Just dwell on this. We send parliamentarians to Holyrood so they can enact the people's priorities. Westminster is just about to ride roughshod over that. If this bill passes, this government in London can interfere directly in all these devolved areas over the heads of the Scottish Parliament and our people. There is only one way to stop them, only one answer, only one option. The only way to defend Scotland's Parliament and its powers is by becoming independent. Our Parliament will consider a new referendum bill before the end of 2021. The chance to choose an independent future is now coming. No amount of Tory denial and disruption can stand in the way of Scotland's people's democratic right to choose a different and a better future. Once it comes, people will have their democratic say, and I am more confident than ever that they will choose to be part of a new Scotland, back at the heart of Europe. We can choose to leave behind the chaos and the instability of Westminster. We can get on by becoming an independent, international, law-abiding nation.
Sir Robert